All right, thanks Sabrina, and thanks everyone for joining again this week. Now we're going to get down to brass tacks today and talk about the cost and how you should think about the cost of your implementation. So as Sabrina mentioned, I'm Eric Newell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Stoneridge Software. I've been doing the Dynamics and Microsoft ERP and CRM sales thing for about a little over 21 years now. I spent my first 13 years with Microsoft and then the last 8 years running Stoneridge Software. And I've also been working on a book called Mastering Microsoft Dynamics Implementation that'll be coming out this spring that talks 23 chapters full of goodness about how to run an implementation. And one of the key things that I talk about early on in the book is how do you get ready for an implementation and how do you make the right choice? So we wanted to dive a little deeper into making that right choice here with this webinar series. So thanks everybody for joining. So again, the goal is to provide ideas on what to look for in a solution and how to conduct a thorough evaluation. And so just a reminder again why it's important. I mean, this product that you choose to be your key platform is going to be the brain of your system strategy for many years. The implementation itself is going to be difficult, time consuming, and expensive. So you want to make sure you're going to get it right because you don't want to have to do it a second time. And it's also going to bring a significant amount of change management. So you want to make sure that you are ready for that and that you've got the team in the right place to be able to be willing to adapt to that change. So a few things about how to do it right. First off, you want to set the parameters by which you make the decisions, and that's why we're talking about these 4 keys today as the key component of how you make that right decision. You want to involve a cross-section of the team, but you want to make sure that you identify the ultimate decision-making process and decision maker. And then you got to make sure that that person is involved in your process. So if you do these 3 things right, you're going to be off to a good start. And now we just wanted to go through with this webinar series and talk a little more detail about how do you make that right decision. So we talked about the 4 keys. This is the 4th session today. We talked about the fit. So how well does the solution fit the business requirements of your business and your industry? Secondly, we talked about the platform. How well does the technology fit into the other technology you've got in your environment today? Is it cloud or on-premise? How well is it supported? How well is it going to integrate with your other line of business apps or other solutions? Last time we talked about the implementer, so who's going to implement this? What is their background and experience, and what is their plan for how to implement this successfully into your company? And then last is today's session on costs. So with that, let's jump into it. So one of the things I try to preach when it comes to the cost of an implementation, you want it to be a little bit like Goldilocks. You want it to be not too low or too high. So I see people make the mistake oftentimes of making it too low and it just doesn't get done right. And then occasionally large companies kind of get this tier 1 vision of, we need to have SAP or Oracle in order to take over the world, and then they end up spending way too much on it and not getting what they want. So you want to find that right happy medium that's going to work for your business. So first off, how much should a project cost? And there is not as much information on the internet as you would like to see about how much to spend on an implementation. So I've seen anywhere from $7,200 a user is what you should spend. I don't think that's really accurate because just because you have 10 people doesn't mean that your project's not complex. What I like to go by is more of this metric, which has been built up over time I think the most accurate way to look at an overall cost of a project. So 3 to 7% of your annual revenue is what a full ERP, or if you're doing a full CRM implementation across all of your sales, marketing, customer service side of your business, that's how much you should be looking at. And you're probably thinking to yourself, that's a lot of money, a lot more than I want to spend on this project. And then I would just go back and say, well, this is going to be the brains of your organization, the heart of all the other systems that you're involved in and you're going to be using. So it really you need to prioritize getting this right, and you don't want to underspend on it and leave you in a position where you have scattered systems and you're not able to scale. So you really should think about setting aside a significant budget for a project like this. So for example, if you're a $100 million company, that would mean that you would pay between $3 and $7 million all in for your project. And when I talk about the project costs, I'm not just talking about the cost of the implementation partner. I'm talking about the software subscription, the ISVs, the internal costs, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about what some of those costs are. But this is the all-in cost, including whatever additional hardware that you might have to put in and those types of things. So what are some ways you can make it, when I do share this with people, they're like, well, how can I make it closer to 3%? Well, 3% is more likely the average if you're a really large company, because there are just economies of scale. So that's one thing. Also, if you're a smaller company and you're like, well, how can I make this closer to 3%? First off, you can limit the number of customizations or scope creep that you have on the project. You want to try to keep it to, a manageable amount that can be predictable that you can get done. You want to try to implement as many standard out-of-the-box processes as possible. By doing that, you're going to be able to keep your costs relatively in check. And then by doing your prep work in advance, so cleaning up your data, getting your processes organized, getting your team in place, doing change management seminars, things like that. All of those things will help you keep your costs down, and it will keep your costs more predictable. Now, what makes it closer to 7%? So I actually went to see a prospect a couple years ago, and they were in the custom T-shirt printing business. And when they talked over what all they had for requirements, and they said, well, I talked to another NetSuite provider, and they said it was going to be, I think it was $200,000 for a relatively small company. And I said, yeah, I think that is what it is. Like, it might even be more than that. Like, you're a very complex company. Everything is a custom order. Everything is custom manufactured. There's just not a lot of repeatable processes. You've got, your team doesn't have a system today. You've got no real IT folks on staff. So yeah, it's going to be closer to the higher end of that number. So those are things to think about. You just may be in a business where the nature of your business is quite complex and it is going to require some more costs. And that's going to be a difficult pill to swallow at the time when you have to pay that amount, but it is going to set you up for success, and it's going to be a big strategic differentiator because a lot of other companies in your business are not going to make that investment. So you're going to have a chance to accelerate ahead of them. So other things that make it closer to the higher number, complex processes, like I mentioned, like engineer to order, not doing any prep work in advance. And then if you just don't have resources prepared, you don't have a definition of who's responsible for what, then you're very likely going to overspend whatever budget it is that you set aside. So again, get ahead of that so you don't have to spend that kind of money in the long haul. So I mentioned the all-in costs. So let's talk about what these all-in costs are, because there are quite a few different things that you should be thinking about as you build your budget or your total cost of ownership over time for this. So the first is software subscription costs. Now this used to be the upfront licensing and annual enhancement, but with the shift to the cloud now, most software is being sold via subscription. So you're going to pay a certain amount per user per month for the number of users that you have, and that's going to be consistent in perpetuity. So if you're interested in learning more about like Microsoft Dynamics costs, Microsoft's got that information out on their website. So they're pretty open about the pricing. It is fairly complex. So I'll look to do another either webinar or article to try to break that down and make that a little bit more consumable. But certainly that's one of the costs that you need to factor into the equation, not only for the first year, but for ongoing. You might have ISVs that you're going to be using, and you'll need to factor in those costs. More and more ISVs are moving to more of a subscription model, but there are some that still are in the pay up front with an annual enhancement type of ongoing payment. But make sure you understand what those are. Now, hardware costs, and you may be thinking, we're implementing in the cloud, we're not going to need any hardware. Well, you might not need any hardware, but you should add this to your list and think it through. The biggest thing to think about in terms of hardware costs would be upgrading your internet speeds in locations that may not have great internet today. So if you're going to use a cloud-based ERP or CRM system, you want to make sure that your smaller locations have strong internet connections and latency, typically under 100 milliseconds. In terms of if you just like ping a server from there, that's going to be what you're going to want to look at. And if it's better than that, you're probably fine. If it's 500 to 1,000 milliseconds to return something from that location, it's probably not going to be a good experience. The other thing is for test environments, you may, depending on if you're in finance and operations, perhaps you might have some test requirements, as well as other ERP systems. You may have other on-premise versions that you can keep of this for testing or for development. And you may, again, have to upgrade some of your developers' boxes if you're doing some development internally. So again, this may end up being zero, but I want to make sure that you're thinking about what the hardware costs might be as you put together your overall cost of the project. Then you've got your implementation consulting. That's going to be the biggest upfront cost, is the cost of your implementation partner and all their resources. You may choose to partner that implementation partner with some subcontractors. You may bring some subcontractors of your own in. If you don't have a project manager on staff and you want to have your own project manager on a project, you might want to consider subcontracting with a project manager. So that's a fairly typical thing. You may want to consider subcontracting some developers if you have developers that, or if you know of people that you think would be good. Just be a little bit careful to make sure that the subcontractors and the implementation partners are going to work well together. Otherwise, you're going to, lose synergy and have challenges there. Your internal team costs. So what is the cost of the people who are going to be involved on the project, and how much time are they going to be spending on the project? In some cases, especially for larger companies, they're going to dedicate people full time to the project. If you're going to do that, then you need to backfill them, and it's pretty clear what their cost is going to be. You take their salaries and their loaded benefits, and you come up with some hard costs for them. Other times it's soft costs, things like, well, they're going to spend 10 hours of their week on it. And that might just mean they can't get another strategic initiative done or something along those lines. Or you may have to, one of the things I've seen people do is they've brought in, or as somebody is about to retire as the controller, for example, they'll bring in a new controller and they'll have them overlap, go through the implementation together, and then the senior one will retire and the new one will take it on. So you've got some overlap in costs there as well too. So whether it's soft or hard, you should try to allocate some time to or allocate some expense to your internal team to make sure you're taking that into consideration. The other thing is travel, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on what you can do to manage that. And then another thing that's maybe not given enough thought to would be e-learning or training. So if you are going to go out to the sites and do training, who's the trainer? How much time are they going to spend? The travel costs related to getting everybody together. Sometimes you might have to meet in a hotel conference room or something like that to be able to get, there might be other costs like that to help support the training. And then e-learning, you may want to choose to invest in an e-learning platform as part of this implementation, or if you've got one today, you might have to expand the number of users. So don't forget about the costs related to training, because they are there and something you need to be thinking about. So with that, all that in mind, all that goes into your 3 to 7%, right? So it's not just your software or your implementation costs that you would go into the 3 to 7% of revenue. It's all this stuff. So now let's think about how you make your case. Like, is this project worth doing? And one of the things I think is important is to calculate the ROI of the project. And to make your case to leadership that you want to do this project, you should have a story that says you're going to make your money back on this project. And whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you should figure out when you expect that break-even point to be, so that the leadership team knows what they're going for here. And you don't want to set unrealistic expectations like this is going to pay for itself in 9 months. I mean, there may be cases where you're doing a CRM project or something like that that could pay for itself fairly quickly. But most ERP projects, you're looking at 18 months to 2 years is probably the best kind of outcome in terms of when it's going to pay it for itself. So you want to make sure that you have a game plan and have that documented. So a couple terms that I'm using here: ROI, so that's the return on investment. So how much will you net from the savings of the new system versus the total cost of ownership of what you're spending on this. And make sure to think about too the costs that you're saving as part of this project. So if you've got annual maintenance with another software that you're going to be able to turn off because you've got this project going, you can use that as part of your ROI, because it is savings that's going to come from you. Forrester has produced a number of what they call total economic impact studies, which are basically the same as an ROI study. And then the other term I'm mentioning is the total cost of ownership. So that's your all-in costs over time. So if you take the costs from the previous slide and log them out from over a 5 to 10 year period, that's what's considered your total cost of ownership. So that's your expense. And then your ROI is taking the efficiencies that you gain from that, subtracting your expenses, and figuring out when you're going to be able to break even. So what are some things you should be thinking about as potential benefits? So here's a list that I found that I thought was really good in terms of some tangible and intangible benefits. So, operating costs, the operating costs of the software itself. One of the big things, if you manage inventory, the amount of inventory you need to hold, or the ability for you to turn that inventory faster. If you're a consulting company, the number of billable hours you can add. Improved customer service might be a little bit less tangible, depending on what that means in terms of more clients for you. Decrease in material costs. Another thing that's not on here, but just better management of margin. So if your margin today is really hard to calculate, and let's say it's 25% today, and after better understanding what your costs are, now you can increase your margin to 29%. I mean, that's a huge impact that's going to have on your long-term business. But you should also be thinking about intangible benefits, and those are things that I would consider more like staff efficiency. So not necessarily having to hire replacements, because you're able to have more people get more things done. You're able to make better decision making, make better decisions from a leadership team, because you have the right scorecards and reporting in place. So you should give that some number. And I know it can be hard for people to say, well, getting better reporting is going to result in, $100,000 in benefit. You will have to guess a little bit on some of that stuff, because there's not a hard and fast way to interpret that. But you should put some dollar value to it that you can justify some way or another, just to make sure that it's clear what the benefits are going to be of a project like this. So one of the other big costs that can come up, and I mentioned a little bit last time when I talked about should you do remote or should you do on-site. One of the things to be thinking about is your travel costs. So travel costs can make up like 15% of your overall budget from just the cost of implementation consultants traveling back and forth on site. I'll tell a story. A few several years ago when I was at Microsoft, I flew out to visit a client, and and I met with them in the morning, and they said, "Oh, well, our consultants are here too." I'm like, "Okay." So I went, and their consultants were sitting together in a room tucked back a long ways away, like in a different building from where the project team was meeting. And so I met them, talked to them. They're like, "Yeah, we come here every week." I'm like, "Well, do you actually meet with the client while you're here, or is this just like they want to supervise you and make sure that you're showing up and doing your thing?" Like that seems like a lot of money to spend to fly somebody out and have them sit in a conference room in another building. So just you should spend some money on travel, because having your consultants on site is an important piece of the implementation, or it certainly can be. But you shouldn't just spend money and fly people out every week for the sake of doing it. You can save a lot of money if you don't do that. Again, they don't need to be there every week. Have them there when there's whiteboarding sessions, training sessions, CRP, original road mapping types of discussions, kickoff meetings, those kind of things. That's when you want the team there. If you can, when they do come on site, try to think about ways that you can minimize the expenses the best you can. So work with local hotels to try to get discounted rates, something that's going to work for the consulting organization. Also try to set like maximum per diems that you're going to allow, just to keep the expenses in check, so they're not going out for prime rib every night on your dime. So those are a few things you can think about to try to minimize travel costs. And then when you do get rolling with consulting, and they are doing some traveling, try to come up with a quicker way to approve the travel. So like build some thresholds in so that so you don't end up spending a ton of time approving travel. That can just take a lot of time from project managers, what I've seen in the past, and at the end of the day, it's probably not worth that time. So next I want to talk about capitalizing costs. So one of the things you can do on a project is you can capitalize some of your implementation costs. So this is, again, only something that you can, this is an option. You don't have to do it. You can certainly expense every cost on the project if you choose to do so. But if you want to spread out the cost, at least on your P&L, over several years, you can certainly do that. So the preliminary project stage, so when you're doing road mapping exercise, things like that, where you're getting up to the kickoff, that you have to expense, as well as anything after you go live, implementation, operation stage, or the empower stage as we call it. So it's really during the heart of the implementation where you can capitalize. And you can see from this slide here, you can capitalize some of the software, the work, the design, the coding, the testing, and some of the data conversion. But you can't capitalize training and some amount of data conversion. So check with your local CPA on the FASB rules as it relates to this if you want to dive into it more, but it is an interesting option, especially if you're concerned about what your short-term, the impact that this project might have on your short-term goals and your short-term numbers.
Eric, can I interject really quick here?
Yeah.
Just have a quick question. Is travel as critical in this day and age, considering how COVID-19 has pushed so much of the work virtually? What direct value exists with in-person meetings, considering the ongoing risks of the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. And I've always said that that on-site is not a requirement. But it does allow you to build relationships faster. So I've been able to build great relationships with people over time who I've never met. So it's more of a speed thing, more of a relationship thing, where you get the benefit from on-sites. But like for our organization, we have not been traveling now for 11 months, with a few minor exceptions, maybe 4 or 5 exceptions of where we've gone out to clients. And certainly we've been able to keep projects moving and get projects done. So you certainly can do things remotely. And I really hope that after the pandemic is over, that the model shifts from what used to be in the like 2010 timeframe, where it was like everybody needs to be on site just about every week, to more of a model where people are on site for key activities like a kickoff, like whiteboarding sessions, like conference room pilots or user acceptance testing and go live and things like that. So pick your spots, pick your people, but by all means, you can do all of this stuff remotely for sure. So thanks for the question. So I'll talk a little bit about contingency, and then we'll open up for our first poll here. So what is contingency? So contingency is just setting aside a little extra budget for things that you don't know yet. So there will be surprises on every ERP or CRM project that you probably haven't budgeted for. So if you're talking about a project that is, you've set aside, $500,000 for this project, what you should do, and you think that's what your costs are going to be because you've added up all the costs, you're looking at your SOW from your partner, you're looking at your software subscription, all those things, and it comes out to 500,000. Do not make that what you go to the board with. Go to the board with a number higher than that to give yourself a little bit of contingency or a little bit of room in case scope gets added. Because what you don't want to have to do is go back to the board for every $15,000, $20,000 add-on. So what that does then, it just shakes the confidence of the board in the project. So if you end up having to go back into the board multiple times for 20,000 here and 50,000 there and 70,000 there, they're going to go, well, you guys don't know what you're doing running this project. So I really, really strongly suggest that you add up all your costs and then add a contingency to that. So that's what you add to address these unforeseen issues that you just don't know what might be happening. So I would recommend adding anywhere from 10 to 20% to your budget. I actually recommend around 20 is probably a good place to be. You might struggle to get that approved by your management team if you ask for 20, but remember, if you ask for 20 and you only spend 10, that money just goes back to the business. So it's not a terrible thing. But make sure that you're setting aside this, and don't necessarily tell your implementer about this, right? Don't necessarily say, oh, yeah, you gave us a statement of work for 300,000, but I've really got a 20% contingency, so I'm good up to 360,000. You don't want to tell them that. You want to try to get them to come in on your $300,000 budget, but now you've got that room that if all of a sudden a high priority change request comes up, great, you've got some money to do it. If something just didn't get done the way you expected it to, something fell down as part of the project, you could put another 10, 20,000 into it and get it taken care of. So it just gives you a lot of cover, and it keeps you from having to go back to your board over and over again to ask for additional money. And I mean, there will be surprises on these projects. There will be something that comes up, and you just, if you plan ahead and you've got some money set aside for it, you'll be far better off. So I wanted to ask a poll question at this time to just get your experience with using contingency in the past. So in your last ERP or CRM project, did you have contingency costs built into it? So just let us know here with that poll, say yes, no, or not sure. I'd be curious to see how everyone has used this in the past.
All right, looks like we have most of the responses in here. 33% of people said that yes, they did have those costs built in. 17% said no, and 50% were unsure.
Okay. Well, thanks for your feedback on that. Certainly hope in your next project that you do budget for some contingency to make sure that you're in good shape and you can handle some wrinkles or curveballs that get thrown at you throughout the project. So now let's just talk about some of the traps that you can fall into that might really affect affect the costs and affect the overall outcome of your project. So one of the things, there was a customer that we worked with early on, and they got bought by a bigger company. And when I went down to talk to them about what their direction they wanted to go with, they said, you know, we want to be a big Fortune 500 company. We can't use some, you know, small software. We got to go with Oracle or SAP because that's what all the other big boys do. So one of the challenges you can run into, especially, and I don't think this is quite as important anymore with cloud software as it maybe used to be in on-premise, but saying that you have to have a tier one solution. So the tier ones typically are Oracle and SAP kind of at the high end, and then Infor and Dynamics 365 finance and operations at the lower enterprise or you know, Fortune 500 to 1,000 range. So you don't necessarily have to have one of the big boys depending on where you're going and what your growth pattern looks like. Again, with the cloud, it's all hosted. You don't necessarily have to have hardware. You can work with those vendors to provide the kind of performance you need. Tier one shouldn't be something that clouds your vision on finding the right solution for you. Another thing is that's on the very low end and tier one can end up costing a ton more. I mean, you're looking at spending $450 to $500 an hour for rates for folks from, you know, the big four accounting firms and things like that. Other thing to think about on the low end of the cost is the fact that, you know, your ERP or CRM doesn't matter. I see this a lot of CRM companies. They buy a super low cost CRM solution like a HubSpot or something like that. And they're like, well, I just need to have a CRM. I'm not going to put any time or effort or thought into it. I just need a CRM system. Like, let me get this in and keep moving. Well, if that's the approach you're going to take, then, you know, just don't spend the money, because if you don't put forethought into it and you just you just put a system in to put a system in, you're not going to get the kind of value out of that system that you expect. So if your approach is, it doesn't matter what I get, I don't care, I just want whatever's cheapest, then you're doing yourself a disservice by even putting in a new system. Other trap I find is when CEOs are not involved in the decision making. What ends up happening, I told a story last time about, you know, there were 5 vendors, all about 550,000, and one that came in at 175,000. And I have been several stories like that where we've been involved in competitive bids for projects. The CEO has not been involved in any of the steps, but they are the ultimate decision maker. And so just think of yourself, if you're the CEO and you're the decision maker and you get presented with 3 different options, one that's 300,000, one that's 400,000, and one that's 500,000. And your committee comes to you and says, we really want to go with the 500,000 option. What are you going to do as a CEO? You're going to say, why not take the 300,000 out? That's cheaper to me. I save $200,000. So if they don't have a perspective of the importance of an ERP or CRM system, then they're not going to appreciate the difference in cost and appreciate the 4 keys and all those types of things. So if you're going to have your CEO make the decision, get them involved, tell them about the 4 things you should be thinking about that go into this decision to make sure it's going to be successful. Because if you choose just based on who the lowest cost is, you're not going to be happy with the implementation. The other thing is I've seen people go, I just want the cheapest rates. So instead of paying, you know, $200 an hour for a resource, I'm just going to go with whoever was willing to do it for $150. Well, yeah, there's a meme that's going around on the internet right now that I thought I would share here, but you know, if I do a job in 30 minutes, it's because I spent 10 years learning how to do that in 30 minutes. You know, you owe me for the years, not the minutes. So that's just something to keep in mind as you think about, do you want the cheapest rates or do you want the biggest bang for your buck? And I would argue that you're much better off trying to get the biggest bang for your buck. So getting the best resources for the most reasonable rate is where you want to be thinking about it, and not just who's cheapest. There are a lot of offshore resources that you can get that are anywhere from 25 to $75 an hour, and that's going to be a lot less than onshore resources. But is that going to give you the outcome that you want? Again, you might want to use a mix of those resources to keep your costs down, but you probably don't want those to be your lead implementers. So be thinking about how do you balance that out and make sure, again, you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. So finally, as you think about your costs, you want to be just right. You don't want to be too low. If you're too low, shortcuts are being taken. Your implementer quality is probably not very good. You're buying software that probably can't meet your requirements. And then on the other side, if you go too high, it could have a huge impact on the financials. There's a lot of horror stories of SAP implementations that have gone way, way over budget, like Cargill and others. It just gets too complex, and you're charging so many dollars an hour that it gets out of control. And those long projects can also have cultural impacts too. People don't want to work on an implementation that's going to take 5 to 7 years to get done. They oftentimes don't have the patience, and they want to get some wins. And it's hard for them to get a win when the project's going to take 5 years to go live. So think about that and try to figure out how you can be in the middle of that spectrum or in the just right area. So if you don't consider cost, you can't necessarily write a blank check. You don't want to necessarily, just pay whatever it costs. You want to be thinking about it. But if you don't consider cost, you're going to be getting pressure from your leadership team, I'm sure, saying, wait, you've spent way too much money on it. But no one doesn't consider cost when you're looking at an implementation. If you only consider cost, this is very common if you're an unsophisticated buyer and you just want to get this done and you don't care what it costs, you just want it to be cheap as possible. This happens all the time. But if you only consider cost, you're ignoring those other 3 key factors of the fit, the implementer, and the platform. So now we've talked about all the 4 different ways to be thinking about this. Now let's talk about the final decision. So how do you make that final decision? So you want to make sure that you're rating your vendors. So let's say you've got 3 vendors that you're looking at. You want to make your decision criteria across these 4 key criteria that we've talked about. So I've seen people in the past make a decision about one company software being 85% fit versus 82% fit. In the grand scheme of things, the extra couple customizations that you'd have to do probably are not nearly as important as the platform it's on, the implementer, and what the overall cost is of the project. But you want to have, and as you're putting your ratings together, you want to have people who represent that area better be responsible for the ratings. So if you're talking about asking about fit, and let's say you're talking about a manufacturing company, you want to ask your manufacturing team, how well is this going to fit your needs? But you don't want to ask them about the platform. You want to talk to the IT team about the platform. Okay, IT CIO, how does this look? How is this going to fit in with the rest of what we're doing? How supportable is this going to be? And then it should be your project team that looks at the implementer and looks at their background, understands what their plan is. And then the finance team can represent the cost side and see if there's options on that side. So put a different team in charge of each of those key areas and then have them all bring their voices to the table. And then rank your top couple vendors in order. It is always possible that you might have to choose your second option depending on the capacity of your first option. It's always possible that they could say, we just can't take your project right now. And again, build the scorecard. So use those 4 different groups to vote on each of the different areas. Weight each of those equally and then determine which one you're going to use as your tiebreaker. Most companies choose fit or cost as their tiebreaker, and that's fine, but make sure that you really think about platform and implementer and include those in your overall in your overall view. So with that really brings us to the end of the series. Thank you again for attending. I do want to ask you one more poll question as you start to think about any questions you might have for me. So Sabrina will put up our second poll question asking about, which of the 4 keys did you have as part of your decision making the last time that you selected a project? So I'm curious to see what you think there, but also as you're filling out the poll, please drop a note in the chat for any questions you might have. Happy to take any questions that are on your mind. All right, Sabrina, do we have a winner in the poll?
Yeah, it looks like we have 20% of people saying that they looked at the fit in the industry, 20% saying cost, and 60% saying they took all 4 into consideration.
Really? Oh, well, that's great. That's much higher than I expected that they took all of them into consideration. Part of what inspired me to do this series and to talk about this so much is just seeing how people generally focus on fit and cost and don't think about platform and implementer, and then they end up regretting it in the end. So that's great to see that more people have thought about that in the past.